Well, good morning. I'm Rob Fenstermacher, and I'm the Chief Content Officer at the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to welcome everyone to this week's Kaffeepause. I'm a different face this morning as Steve Sokol is out of the office and couldn't be with us today, so I'm pleased that I get to do this in his stead. And we're also very pleased to have Dr. Anna Sauerbrey, who is the foreign editor for the weekly DIE ZEIT and is also a 2018 ACG Kellen Fellow, with us today to share her insights on current events and issues in Berlin and Germany as we start the week. So welcome, Anna. It's great to have you back to the Kaffeepause. I think it's been a few months, but it's always great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
So we often like to begin the Kaffeepause asking about the overall political mood in Germany. So maybe you could just describe a little bit, what's the atmosphere in Berlin as we start the week and the country as a whole?
Well, that's of course hard to say, but I would say that the mood is not too bad at all. I mean, spring is coming to Berlin too, which is always a bit late in comparison to other parts of Germany. But I think what we may note is that we have reached this spring without a winter of discontent, with Germany's energy reservoirs over 60% full. So we still have some gas to go, and some have saved some for next winter. I think that's important to know. Even there was another open letter initiated by Sarah Wagenknecht from the Left Party and Alice Schwarzer, a very prominent feminist in Germany, that has drawn less of a crowd than expected. At the end of February, there was a demonstration here in Berlin, but there was a large crowd also turning up to a pro-Ukrainian demonstration the day before. I think the polls show that when it comes to Ukraine, the support for Germany's military aid to Ukraine is still fairly strong, with around 45% of Germans thinking it is about right, and some 15 to 20% even thinking that it should be more. And of course, a large group too that is thinking it should be less, or we should make more of a diplomatic effort. But I think there is still a lot of support for Germany's Ukraine policies. I would say that these days, the war in Ukraine is somewhat receding to the background of the political debate. We've had a fierce debate over the delivery of the Leopard tanks, which was decided early this year. But since then, the atmosphere is somewhat calmed. There are some new topics on the agenda that take a lot of the political attention now, one of which is migration. And I would say we don't know where it's headed yet. As you may know, Germany has taken in 1 million refugees from Ukraine, mostly women and children, but also around 250,000 others who came from all different parts of the world to Germany this past year. Many communities, many municipalities are right now grappling to house them, first of all. And there have been some fierce local conflicts about the housing situation, which of course affects Germans who live in those cities too. We have the Bavarian election coming up this fall, and it seems like Bavarian minister president is ramping up his campaign on the migration issue, but also over cultural issues like eating meat. And I think this will be it will be sort of a thermometer for where the German mood is right now, whether these narratives really spark a debate overall in Germany, whether this stays in Bavaria, and we will see throughout the year how these topics develop in comparison to the Ukraine war.
Maybe we could come back to the immigration issue, as we discussed earlier before we started the conversation today, but sort of some of the topics that the CDU and the CSU are maybe utilizing to gain support. Would you say, since you touched on the fact that the Ukraine war has sort of waned a little bit in terms of the focus, are people's concerns also about the heating and an energy issue also receding a little bit as a result as well?
Yes, I do think so. The German government has actually done a pretty good job of cushioning the effects in the cost of energy. The social security has been raised, so I think many people, of course, are struggling, like in the US too, to make ends meet. Inflation is still high, but we have expected so much worse that I think this has really had a calming effect. Of course, there's the next winter to come, and it's good to have those reservoirs with some gas left for the next winter. But of course, we don't know how prices will evolve. Right now, it seems like it's pretty stable, but who knows how the war is evolving? Who knows how other countries will whether the contracts that Germany was able to secure with other countries on energy deliveries will hold. So I think we're good for now. Let's see what next winter brings.
Right. That has been the concern, is that this winter was survivable and able to get through that, but that next year could potentially be worse and more challenging. So one topic that has not, in fact, receded, I think, even over the last 6 years, is the issue of the 2% GDP defense spending goal. And last week, there were reports that this goal was actually going to be enshrined in writing in the National Security Strategy, which is soon to be released. And it's a strategy that's also a first for Germany, that there'll actually be a national security strategy. And there's been pressure for years, especially from other NATO members, obviously under President Trump, for Germany to meet this target. So now the pressure will be on Chancellor Scholz and the government to meet this goal. And there are indications that Germany's not on track to meet it this year, nor that they're likely to meet it next year. Also last week, Eva Högel, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Armed Forces, presented her annual report. And she was very critical that not a single cent of the 100 billion that was announced during Scholz's Zeitenwende speech last year, and the special fund that was created to modernize the Bundeswehr, that none of that has actually been spent. And that the defense spending, procurement, all of those things need to be made more efficient if, one, the 100 billion is going to be spent, or that 2% goal is going to be met. How has her report been received in Germany? And is there a plan? Is there a timeline for how to spend the money? And can Scholz and the coalition government actually deliver on these two promises?
I think it was very well received among experts and the opposition. It was well received also among some critics of the coalition within the coalition, such as Agnes Strack-Zimmermann from the Liberal Party. And I think that most of these voices agree with Eva Högel's main points, that the money needs to be spent more quickly and in a more efficient way. I don't think there's an overall master plan yet of how to spend it. In the current household, there are some 50 billion in the regular household, and some 8 billion will be spent from the special fund of the 100 billion that Scholz had announced in his Zeitenwende speech. I think most people agree that this money will not be enough to really consolidate the Bundeswehr or actually just make it work. Even Boris Pistorius, the defense minister, has now said we need 10 billion more. Other projections, Högel herself has pledged for 200 billion more. You see, there's a large gap between those figures, and most experts here would rather go with the 200 billion, I believe, than the other. We need to spend a double-digit amount in ammunition alone just to by what Germany has given to Ukraine and restore our own deposits. I think that what's relatively concrete is that some of what is now projected to be spent from the 100 billion goes to the F-35, which is to replace the Tornado in Germany, contribution to the US nuclear shield over Germany and Europe. I don't think there are figures yet like how much will be spent in the next household year. We've just had the household negotiations, which came up with those two amounts, the defense budget and the 8 billion. And I think they still are working on a plan of how much can be spent next year in 2024. The German government keeps saying, well, we can't spend it as quickly. This takes time. We need to place our orders with the industry. But I think everybody, like there have been some projections by economic institutes here in Germany that the 2% goal will be failed this year, next year, and probably in 25 too.
You get the sense that the political class fully is on board with these goals? And is there a difference between the politicians wanting to actually commit to this versus the general German public? Do they really care, or is this a topic that we're all talking about sort of at again, the international level or amongst politicians?
I think there's a general mood in the German public that the Bundeswehr should be funded properly. So I think you would have very little resistance to the 2% goal in the general public. I think it's a figure that most people don't really, I mean, people don't really care about the figure. They just want the soldiers to be equipped properly. Now that the Bundeswehr is not in a state of emergency or a state of alarm, but of course the possibility of war has become much more concrete in Germany, and people want to be safe. They want to be protected, and they want a functioning Bundeswehr. I am not entirely sure how much this is shared by all the parties in this coalition. I think there's still some holding back by some parts in the Social Democratic Party of really spending it in a very offensive, very forward-looking way. I do think that the need is seen both in the defense ministry. We have had a very energetic start by the new defense minister, Pistorius, and I think it's seen in the Chancellery and the Foreign Office too. So I think it's just that they're really grappling with the very fundamental technical problems of making the Bundeswehr being able to spend it properly. There needs to be some structural reform at the same time.
Right. And do you feel like that is being done? Is again, we're all talking about spending the money, but are there then simultaneous efforts actually taking place to do that structural reform or not?
If yes, it's only beginning. And I think the history of those reforms in Germany in the past 10 years doesn't project too much optimism, because so many others have tried and failed. But I think that Pistorius is in a very good position to do so, with a lot of public support, with the support from the Chancellery, and also with the support from within the Bundeswehr, because I think there's a lot of pressure. He has just changed at the top position in the Bundeswehr. He's put a new person in place, who's a person, General Breuer, who's very familiar with the politics in Germany. He was the head of the Corona task force in the Chancellery for a little over a year. So he knows the political structure, he knows who to talk to, he knows all the main protagonists. That's something that gives me some hope that there will be a way forward.
So I want to bring in one question that we got in the Q&A that touches a little bit on this, but the question about conscription, which ended back in 2011, how much of an issue is that continuing to play in Germany's defense readiness? Is it an issue? Is there talk of reversing that in some way? Does it create a moral hazard that there's not this connection?
There has been a debate, but not too much, about bringing it back. I think it just would not be feasible in a practical way. All the structures that you need to conscribe young men and women, probably to the Bundeswehr, they have been leveled. So it would take a long time to rebuild those structures, to have those people being conscribed, going to their medical exams, being integrated into the Bundeswehr, that's all gone. So I think it would be a very large organizational project to bring that back. Also, I don't think there's a lot of practical support for that. It is true that the Bundeswehr is also short on soldiers. So we should be at around 200,000 soldiers. We're only at 180,000 now. So they're very much looking for personnel. When you walk around German cities, you're sure to see advertisements to join the Bundeswehr on many billboards. They're really trying hard, and they need to try harder because they're short of personnel. I don't think anybody really sees this as a feasible solution to bring back conscription. There has been a debate of maybe introducing a year of service instead. So everybody so young people, when they leave school, should enter a year of service, not necessarily in the military service, yes, but also they could choose between the civil service and the military service. Some debate, but also no concrete political way forward on that, I think.
Okay. So the other news that is taking place today is President Xi is visiting Moscow and meeting with President Putin. And this is taking place on the heels of Putin actually visiting Mariupol over the weekend, which is one of the occupied regions in Ukraine since the invasion last year. Can you tell us a little bit about how this visit is being viewed in Germany by the government, especially given that Xi is claiming that this is part of a peace plan and sort of trying to achieve peace, yet his 10-point plan that he, I guess, put out about a week or 2 weeks ago has already been dismissed by Scholz and many others. So just overall, how is this being viewed in Germany today?
There is a lot of media attention, certainly, and I think a lot of political attention to this visit. It has been the major news this morning, and it certainly will be in the coming days. As you've said, politically, the peace plan has been dismissed. Some may have expected more or more tangible suggestions from the Chinese side, especially after Wang Yi's very forceful appearance at the Munich Security Conference this February, calling out the West, saying that Europeans, that the US and its European allies are prolonging this war. But then very little actually came out of the peace plan. I think this is mostly seen as a symbolic visit, a show of force on China's side, trying to show that it's a major player in international relations, making itself a leader in possible or offering impossible peace talks. But also many analysts have pointed out that it's hard to be a mediator when at the same time you're supporting Russia in many different ways, even with the possibility of delivering weapons or dual-use goods to Russia, and then at the same time trying to be the mediator in the conflict when you've already taken sides. So I guess that's what also policymakers in Germany pointed out this morning.
So sticking with China for a little bit, obviously the other issues that have been in the news related to China are the stories that Olaf Scholz's government plans to ban or force companies to remove the use of Huawei technology and the ZTE technologies. And Deutsche Telekom, Vodafone, and Telefonica have used many of these components, and in some cases it's for 60% of their components in their new 5G networks being installed around Germany. So how is this push by the government being viewed, both kind of on the economic business side of things, but also by the general public?
I think first, I would say that we're not yet there. The German government is not yet forcing the companies to really rip and replace Chinese components. Germans do what Germans do. They have asked the companies to make a list of the critical equipment, and then they will revisit the list and review it. And then they will decide what to do with it. I think it is a major step, though, given the German history on the 5G networks. These are now components that are not within the central grid, but which were used in the antennas that are up here in Germany. But of course, it's an important part of the grid that facilitates telecommunications in Germany. So I was surprised that the German government would go as far. We've seen first drafts of Germany's first China strategy that we're expecting later this spring, probably earlier in early summer, to be put forward. Some of it was in the press already, and this was not part of the China strategy, so it came somewhat unexpected. The more tangible parts that we've seen were more on investment guarantees for companies who invest in China, calls for diversification, especially when it comes to critical resources that are imported from China. So this is I think this is a step forward, which is more in line with what the US are demanding Germany to do, or have been demanding Germany to do for a decade or so.
Do you think this is obviously telecommunications that is being focused on in this particular case, but there's obviously Chinese battery companies. I think there's even a plant in Germany that's producing batteries for cars. Is there concern amongst businesses that the same kind of thinking is now going to be applied to other technologies? I mean, how is business reacting to this as a sign of maybe the shifting away from the dependence on China?
Well, the first reaction from the telecom companies were calls for compensation. So if we have to rip it out, we'll go to court and we'll make you pay for it. That was the first reaction. I think it's hard to compare it to, for example, the battery question, or also for what's really important to Germany right now is green transition. And Germany's green transition is in many parts very much dependent on China. China's delivering wafers for solar panels and, of course, raw materials for solar panels to Germany. I think telecommunications, in a way, is easier to do because there are alternatives on the European market for those components used, which in some cases is not easily done for the raw materials and the wafers that we need for the green transition. So I think for now they're trying with this technology. And the other will have to go much slower, and with other policy measures, more like incentives for diversification, for example. I think when it comes to the German economy as a whole, there and its view on China, there no longer is like a common stance. We see very many small and medium enterprises withdrawing from the Chinese market, reshoring some of their sites to Germany or other European countries, also to the US. We see the BDE, the German Industrial Association, which has taken a much more critical stance on China in these past years. But then, of course, there are like the 4 or 5 big DAX companies who are still full in on the Chinese market. BASF, the big chemical company, also Volkswagen and BMW, and their CEOs are given one interview after another saying that they are fine. They want to stay on the Chinese market, and they are not giving it any second thoughts.
So I wanted to weave in again a question that came in on the Q&A that I think touches, you mentioned the China strategy that is coming out. Does the China strategy include anything thinking about scenarios such as China invading Taiwan and how Germany would react to that and prepare for that in advance, that's a likely scenario or a possible scenario?
I would be surprised if the China strategy, I mean, it will contain a couple of sentences on Taiwan, reiterate the German position that if there are any changes of the current state, it must be done in a peaceful way, which I think will be one sentence in the strategy, or at least it was in the leaked papers that we have seen. I don't think it will give a time horizon for that. And I don't think there will be concrete steps named in the strategy. I think what the German government, particularly the Ministry for the Economy, is already doing is, first of all, analyzing the dependencies, analyzing the situation and what it would mean if from one day to the other, Germany would be cut off chips, technologies, and or would have to join in US sanctions against Taiwan. I think that the China strategy will be in a more general rhetoric and not lay out any concrete scenarios.
Thank you. So you were recently in India for the G20 foreign ministers meeting, and India throughout the war in Ukraine has been fairly reluctant to speak out against Russia's aggression in Ukraine. And you've also recently written in Die ZEIT about India's evolving position vis-a-vis Russia. Could you talk a little bit about how India's position is changing?
Yes, I went to the G20 foreign ministers meeting alongside Annalena Baerbock, and then I stayed on for the Raisina dialogue in Delhi, which is sort of a Munich security conference just in Delhi. And I went there. I took an interest because I haven't been there last year, and many European policymakers and analysts and journalists who came back from last year's summit were rather shocked at the Indian rhetoric or other voices from the global south. And I think Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar has really shocked Europeans into a new consciousness of where his country stands and where the global south stands on these problems. He said at the Raisina dialogue, but also repeated that here on European security conferences, that Europe tends to think its problems are the world's problems, but doesn't want to have anything to do with the world's problems. I felt that the rhetoric has changed, that India, as the G20 president this year, has taken on a different diplomatic language. It now stresses that territorial integrity is important, that it should be reinforced everywhere in the world, mostly without calling out Russia. It's sort of a division of labor between Prime Minister Modi, who takes a more presidential stance, calling for peace, calling for both sides to start talking, and Jaishankar, the foreign minister, who is pushed for a common resolution of the G20 finance ministers who have also met this spring, and the foreign ministers meeting. He pushed for a resolution that would have included Ukraine, and it was blocked by Russia and China, but India went so far as to put out a terrorist declaration in which it deplores, in the strongest term, I quote, Russia's aggression against Ukraine. So that was, I felt, a big step forward. I think India's fundamental position is not going to change. It won't join in Western sanctions. It will keep buying Russian oil. But I think that India is also seeing the chances that come for India to form closer ties with the European Union, for example, on an Indian-European trade deal, free trade agreement, and also hopes for maybe German or European weapons deliveries to India, because it's now getting most of its weapons from Russia, but that is not working too well. Russia is not able to deliver what it should deliver to India right now, so they're looking for alternatives too.
You get the sense, you mentioned, this sort of perception that India had and the global south and the concerns about the West's position and focusing on Ukraine. At this meeting, Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, called out to Sergei Lavrov, her counterpart in Russia, to stop this war, and clearly took a strong line for the West. At the same time, Sergei Lavrov, I saw various clips on Twitter where he was saying, putting the blame on the West, of course, in the typical kind of propaganda format. And the Twitter posts were talking about how people laughed at that. But I heard from many other people that actually was very brief and that it actually seemed to get a lot of resonance there as well. So I'm kind of curious, what was the overall mood and reception sort of from Annalena Baerbock's perspective, but also from the Russian perspective on the war in Ukraine and how it's proceeding? And should we be concerned about how that is being viewed?
When you travel with the foreign minister's delegation, you of course have a problem of sources because they are your main source. We are obviously, as journalists, not allowed into the room when the G20 foreign ministers sit. So their feeling, German diplomats felt that she was very successful in calling out Lavrov. She did not talk to him privately on the margins of the summit, other than Antony Blinken ended up doing, at least for a very brief interlocutor and conversation on the sidelines. He did sit through her remarks, as he did through many other European countries' remarks who joined in calling Russia to end this war. And German diplomats felt that they were making some progress also with other countries in the global south on the issue. I think many other countries are very much harder than Germany, of course, feeling the economic fallout from this war. They want it to end, and I think they're starting, even if not in the strong language as the Europeans do, asking Russia to end this war. And the remarks by Lavrov were made at the Raisina dialogue. I was in the room, and I thought it was very hard to grasp the mood, because there was the laughing at the most outrageous statements he made, claiming that Russia was being attacked, that there was a war waged against Russia. There was some laughing, that is true, but of course there were also many Europeans in the room. The Raisina dialogue was directly after the G20 foreign ministers meeting, so many delegations just stayed on. There was a room that was at least a quarter full of Europeans or Western countries, also a large American delegation there. And the one time he got some applause, I would say, from rather delegates from the global south, was when he mentioned the Iraq war. I think that still is a very sensitive point for many of these countries, a symbol for what is perceived as American moral hypocrisy. So he did get some applause for that. And even though I think my impression is that Indian diplomats are very much aware of the blatant lies, but still feel that it is their interest and their good right to cooperate with Russia on the issues like defense. They feel they need to cooperate with Russia on. Excuse me.
So I was going to ask you maybe at the very end about the Iraq war, given that we are at the 20th anniversary of the beginning of that invasion 20 years ago. So maybe I'll ask it now, since we just touched on it, is sort of how is that 20th anniversary being viewed in Germany? Obviously, we heard what it was like in India a few weeks ago and how it's still a big issue. It was obviously a huge issue in Germany as well at the time. So how is that now being viewed 20 years after the fact?
Well, I guess the German, it wasn't too much of a media buzz around this day. A couple of newspapers ran stories, but they focused more on Iraq as a country. Where does it stand today? There were some reporters assigned to Iraq who wrote about the development of Baghdad. The ZEIT, my newspaper, we had a reporter who went to Abu Ghraib, spoke to people who have been inmates of this prison, both during the American occupation, but also under Saddam before, and under the Iraqi government afterwards. So it was more of a focus on the very interesting developments in the region since the Iraq War. I would have expected maybe a little more of, the German left feeling vindicated about Germany's position back then, Schröder saying no to participating in the coalition of the willing. I didn't see too much of that, not too many statements. Rather, I feel it's rather taking a step back, looking at where democratization efforts, liberalization efforts of the West have gone wrong. So it was seen in, or like a bit of a depressed mood in some of the essays also published on this day, how little was really achieved both in the region and beyond, and a self-questioning, a little soul-searching of what foreign policy and also military interventions really can achieve in these terms.
Do you think there was also perhaps some hesitation to talk about it, given that there is obviously the question of intervention in Ukraine and how involved to be in? So let's not talk about that, because that just raises this issue and maybe allows more people to be critical of the current state of play.
I'm not sure there's a link, at least not in Germany, because I think most of the German public has always been on Schröder's side and saying no to this intervention. I think it's different in Ukraine because to most people, as we also see in the polls that I have cited in the beginning, it's much more obvious that Russia is the aggressor, that Ukraine, a democratic, liberal country, is the victim of this aggression, and that there is a need to support Ukraine in its fight. And also, I think what's a big difference is that many Germans feel that this really touches on our very own security interests here in Europe, rather than a war that is a couple of thousand kilometers away somewhere in the Middle East.
Right. So we have just a few more minutes left, and maybe I'll bring it back to Germany and some news that happened last week, which was that the Bundestag passed a new electoral law that will shrink the size of the Bundestag, which has really ballooned in recent years to 736 members, which, if I remember correctly, now makes it the largest democratically elected parliament. The House of Lords in Britain, and I think the Chinese parliament's actually a bit bigger, but they're not democratically elected. Can you briefly explain why has it gotten so large, maybe trying to avoid the complexity of all the German voting system, which can be very complicated? But what are the changes to the law, and who's going to be, quote, the winners from this law and potentially, quote, the losers if the law finally goes through? I guess it was passed, but if it's not challenged.
Right, that's a really hard task you've challenged me to right now. It's explaining German electoral law. I think that the basic problem is that Germany has a mixed system where some of the delegates are elected directly, like they are in the United States, and to the larger part, it's a proportional system where you elect a party, and then the party sends delegates to the Bundestag, and Germany has tried to make both to make both ends come together. So the rule actually was, and there was a ruling by the German Supreme Court in 2013 that all of the people who had directly voted to the Bundestag need to enter the Bundestag, but in order to still represent the proportions, it would stock up the seats in the Bundestag. So with many more parties, or the German party system changing and trying to make both the proportionate and all the directly elected representatives actually be represented in the actual Bundestag, it kept growing. And now here in Berlin, it's really funny when I've just met a representative a couple of weeks ago who lives or who has his offices in one of those buildings. They had to add to the already large existing structures. Some of them still work in containers just to make it work. Containers that are put up here in the central government district in Berlin. So this is really no longer feasible. And this is the third legislature. They are trying to come up with a solution. One of the solutions now is that some of the directly elected representatives will not enter the Bundestag. I think it would have been a good solution, but they have tweaked it at the last minute. They are sort of annulling one of the extra rules that make the German system even more complicated. That is, if a party does not hop over the 5% hurdle that prevents very small parties from entering the Bundestag, it can still be represented in the Bundestag if it wins 3 direct elected representatives. They're cutting this now, which will affect both the far left Die Linke Partei, but might also affect the Bavarian sister party of the Conservatives, the Christian Democrats, which is a regional party really, gets very large percentages in Bavaria, but of course may not hop the 5% hurdle nationally. I hope I haven't gotten any people too confused, but that's what's debated right now. Is this sort of an anti-Bavarian law, and is this a law created to make the left party or to kick them out of the Bundestag?
How likely do you think it is that the Federal Constitutional Court could strike this down? I mean, I think that's the hope, right? The CSU, and I'm guessing the Die Linke are also going to challenge this law and try and bring a case to the Constitutional Court.
Yes, it will definitely be challenged. I'm not a constitutional scholar, so I find it hard to say. What I can say is that 3 of very renowned constitutional scholars who were actually consulted by the coalition beforehand, the reform, have said that this could be struck down if those extra rules apply. So I think there is a certain likelihood this will not hold.
Okay. So I guess I had one final question, and I hope I can ask it. We actually didn't discuss it in advance, but it's talking about, and it sort of touches on this sort of reforms to things, the citizenship reform, where Scholz has indicated that the coalition wants to reduce the number of years before a resident is eligible for naturalization, and to lift kind of the near total ban on dual citizenship, which would obviously allow many of the Turkish community to now become German citizens and not have to deal with that issue. I think on 2 fronts. One, how likely is that something that they can just institute, and is there going to be huge challenges to it? But it also goes back to our earlier point at the beginning of the conversation about immigration and migration, and that the CDU and the CSU have been using that topic as a way to sort of win voters and be a little more conservative, and it might help them. How do you see that playing out in the coming months?
I do think they can institute it. They have the majority for that. I think the coalition is pretty much on the same page on this issue. All 3 parties are in support of it. I think other than a couple of years ago, the CDU will not be that opposed to such a regulation. I mean, they have criticized it, of course, publicly when the coalition came out with this supposition, with a first draft. But I think in general, the CDU being very close, having close ties to the German economy, and particularly small and medium enterprises, they also see that Germany is very much in need of migration, of experts coming to Germany, working here. Germany is a shrinking society. It needs migration. And I think they will tackle illegitimate migration from another end, and that is people who come here via the asylum track, who come here as illegally, or as victims to trafficking, and I think we will have much more of a debate on how to send those people back to their countries of origin, how to cooperate with countries of origin to take people back who do not have citizenship here. The citizenship rule would apply to people who already have a job, who already do speak the German language. None of these demands are diminished. It's just the time frame that they can they could become citizens sooner, but of course they still have to comply with all those other requirements.
Thank you for answering that question that we hadn't prepared for necessarily at the beginning. Well, Anna, there's never a shortage of topics and issues that we could discuss, but unfortunately we've run out of time. But I really want to thank you again for helping us understand a number of the issues that are currently facing Germany. Our audience and our members really appreciate it. And it's always a pleasure speaking with you. And I hope we can have you back in a few weeks, or a few months, actually. A few weeks would be very quick, but a few months.
All right. Always happy to be here.
Yes, and thank you also to all of our attendees who posed some great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't answer them all, but I think we had a great engaging conversation today. So I wish everyone a wonderful rest of the day. Und auf Wiedersehen. Bye-bye.